The medical beliefs of scholars such as Hippocrates and Galen, developed in ancient Rome and Greece, remained the standard medical practice and thought throughout the medieval period and into the Victorian era. However, in the 1800s, this all began to change, when medical dissection of human remains became the standard practice for teaching medicine. However, the question stands, how did these medical teachers and students get a hold of human remains for dissection? And what does it have to do with serial killers? Hello everybody and welcome to the first ever episode of the Resurrectionist podcast. I am your host, the Resurrection Woman, Megan McGrath. I am so excited to have you all here for the first ever episode where we will be discussing our podcast's namesake, The Resurrectionists, the OG Resurrectionists. Before we get into that, I thought I'd give you a little background on myself. Don't worry, we'll get into the reason you're here soon enough. Just let me have my little narcissistic me moment first. So, my name is Megan. I am an assistant osteoarchaeologist, which means that I study archaeological human remains. Mostly this means bones and skeletons from archaeological sites, which means over 100 years, basically. I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology and classical studies, and then I did my master's in human osteology, and I've been working as an archaeologist for over a year, and as an osteologist for 6 months about now. Very exciting. I have a love for all things archaeology and osteology, and when you're in a field like mine, dealing with human remains, you learn about the more morbid parts of human past, and what I find most fascinating is the things that we nowadays would consider morbid, but that in the past were considered quite normal, like burying the dead under your house. Not even dead that are related to you, just dead under your house. Normal, not a serial killer. Fascinating. So these are some of the topics that I want to discuss with you guys, share with you guys through this new podcast, The Resurrectionists. So I hope that you will be willing to stick around and learn everything there is to learn about the morbid past, morbid human history. I think it is all so fascinating, and I just want to have a conversation with you guys about it because I think it's interesting. So without further ado, let's get into the reason why you are here. The messed up origins of modern medicine and the Resurrectionists. So as I mentioned in my intro, medical beliefs and practices that were, practiced for hundreds of years before it all began to change. We'll get to the change. But before the change, most of medical beliefs and practices were based off of the works of Hippocrates and Galen. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Hippocrates from the Hippocratic Oath. He wrote the Hippocratic Corpus. Whether or not he actually wrote it is debatable. I think it's widely believed that Hippocrates at least wrote some of it. It's debated as to whether or not he wrote all of it, or if students of his or admirers of his wrote the rest of it. Doesn't really matter for the purpose of this. It's just an interesting fact. So they were sort of the two big names in medicine that perpetuated throughout the centuries and that people followed for centuries. The issue with their sort of belief of human anatomy and of medical practice was that it was based on the dissection of animals. So Galen dissected animals and based his human anatomy on what he was seeing in animals. And clearly, animal, human, not always the same. There are some animals that are similar, but even then it's not always the same. So a lot of our medical knowledge that we had for centuries was based off of animal anatomy and not human anatomy, and therefore the medical practices probably would have worked better on an animal than a human. Galen, you should have been a vet, my dude, is essentially what I'm hearing. But there were some human dissections that were taking place, though they were incredibly rare and were considered to be taboo. The most well-known ones were in Alexandria, but they were widely considered unpopular for them to happen. It is also thought, speculated, believed, not believed, that vivisections were taking place in Alexandria, which was dissecting living people. See, I've been debating putting trigger warnings on these episodes because frankly I feel like if you're listening to this podcast after reading the bio and reading the description and listening to the trailer, you should kind of know what you're getting yourself into. But yeah, vivisection, dissecting a living person. Debatable as to whether it was happening in Alexandria. I kind of hope it wasn't, because that sounds like a terrible way to die. So that was sort of our understanding of human anatomy and of medicine for hundreds of years, was based on animals and questionable human dissections in Alexandria. But like I said, the ones that happened in Alexandria were incredibly unpopular, did not last long, and didn't really lead to much from what I can understand. I think it might have led to some improvements on our understanding of how the human heart works, but I don't believe that actually caught on. Like, they were more accurate than Galen's beliefs, but because of how the knowledge was come across and because of how the individual who came across, I wrote a whole paper on this one, so I literally can't remember any of it, but essentially I think that his theories about how the human heart worked were more accurate to how the human heart actually works, but because of multiple factors, Galen's belief was the main belief of how the human heart worked for centuries. That is until Andreas Vesalius in the 1500s. So up until this point, medicine was mostly taught either by an individual paying to work under a physician and learn from them, essentially working as an assistant to the physician until they became a physician in their own right. Or once medical schools were developed, it was mostly taught via text, and most of these texts were Galen and Hippocrates. Andreas Vesalius in the 1500s was one of the first people who he probably wasn't the first people to think it, but he was one of the first people to practice that if one is learning human anatomy, one should gain first-hand experience of human anatomy, that you shouldn't just take someone else's word from a book, and that you should actually try and gain an understanding for yourself to become a better physician and to have a better understanding. And so Vesalius conducted human dissections. From these human dissections, he gained a greater understanding of human anatomy and the human skeletal system. He published a number of books on human anatomy and the human skeletal system, which included these amazing engravings of human skeletons. They're some of the first published anatomically accurate human skeleton engravings, and they are beautiful because they're not just like flat skeleton. They're like, if you look them up, look up Vesalius skeleton. They're cool. I have a tattoo based on one of them. Yeah, I'm fangirling. Anyway, they're cool sketches. My point is that it wasn't until this point that we had anatomically correct images of human skeleton, human organs, like just human anatomy in general. And not only did Vesalius publish some of the first anatomically correct images of a human, but he also corrected over 300 mistakes that Galen had made on his assumptions of human anatomy. So that's sort of when our understanding of human anatomy began to change and began to become more accurate, I suppose. It's also when people began understanding that if you wanted to learn human anatomy and learn medicine, that maybe like actually practicing and studying, gaining first-hand experience was better than just taking a centuries-old text and presuming it was right because Galen wrote it. That being said, this sort of idea of human dissection to learn didn't really grow until around the 1700s. And that's when 17th century is kind of when medical texts became more accessible, medical research became more accessible. And once it became more accessible, it became greater in volume as well. People began doing more medical research, began wanting to study medicine more because they were exposed to it more. It's one of the reasons I wanted to start this podcast, is to educate people on archaeology and, hopefully get people more invested in it. So once medical texts and research became more available, more people began getting interested and more people wanted to learn. And so medical schools became more popular, became bigger institutions than they had been before. The issue with this is, however, that the use of human cadavers for the purposes of dissection and teaching was also becoming popular in these medical schools, and it was what the students wanted. And if the students were paying a hefty price to be at medical school, you're going to give them what they want, essentially. So the use of human dissection in teaching medical students started to become the norm in these medical schools that were growing in volume. So in 1752, the Anatomy Act was brought in, which meant that the Company of Surgeons in London was allowed to conduct public dissections of convicted murderers and to expose the corpse to general view. So essentially that meant that when an individual was sentenced to be executed, they could also be sentenced so that their body, once executed, would be taken by the Company of Surgeons and would be dissected for the masses, essentially. What this meant was that surgeons would have access to the bodies of convicted murderers who were executed for the purposes of teaching medical students the art of dissection and teaching anatomical study and teaching medical practices to these students. The issue with this, however, is that, first of all, family members were not happy about this. Obviously, a lot of them would try and remove the bodies from the scaffolding before they could be taken to the anatomists because they didn't want this to happen to their family members. A lot of people at this time believed in the sanctity of the body and that the body had to be preserved as best possible after death. And so to them, being sent to the anatomist and being dissected was worse than being executed because you were damning your body for an eternity after you had been executed. Not only this, but this punishment, because it was seen as so extreme, was not every individual sentenced to be executed was not sentenced to be dissected as well. A lot of the time, the punishment was given to those who had committed the most heinous of murders, or just like the worst of the worst, mostly just to give an example to the people, like, this is what will happen to you. If you do this, you will be dissected for the public. That's one of the reasons why it was made public as well, was as a deterrent. But of course, this meant that less people were committing these heinous crimes and therefore less people were being sentenced. Also, because not every individual was being sentenced to be dissected, there wasn't a huge volume being produced from these sentencings as had perhaps originally been intended as to be used for the purposes of medical teaching. The hope probably had been that there would be more cadavers to be used in teaching. However, the numbers just never lined up. There was always too many students and too few bodies. which is why a lot of the times at the beginning of the school year, surgeons and their students would go out to graveyards and steal their own bodies for use in the dissection classroom. These bodies usually were supposed to have died within 10 days or around there. Obviously, the fresher the better. They want them as well preserved as they can be. They also had methods of preserving them themselves once they got them back to the universities. But they wanted the bodies to be as fresh as possible, as to, have the best canvas for study. I don't know, that's not the right term. You know what I mean? So the medical students used to go out at the beginning of the year and essentially steal their own cadaver for study. If you didn't steal a cadaver, you didn't have a cadaver to study. So I guess they had these grave robbing parties at the beginning of each year, which I don't know about you, but that don't sound like a hoot and a holler to me. And I like morbid shit, but that's too morbid even for me. But the problem with it, at the time, robbing a body was technically not considered a crime. I believe the trespassing and the destruction of property and the theft of objects that were on the corpse were crimes, but the actual stealing of the corpse or defiling of the corpse was not a crime. The corpse was seen as a item, not as a person anymore. At the time, that was not considered to be a huge crime. But as it went on and people began to realize what was happening, and there was all these bodies showing up in anatomy schools and they couldn't really explain where they were coming from, people began to realize sort of what was going on. Obviously, you show up at a grave one day to place flowers on your relative's headstone and you find that things been dug up, you're going to realize what's going on. So as opposed to the medical students having to go out and risk being caught, they started paying other individuals to go out and steal these bodies for them. And these individuals became known as resurrectionists, literally resurrecting the dead. Resurrectionists. That's where it comes from. So these resurrectionists made a profession out of going to graveyards and stealing bodies. Also, undertakers would make additional money by selling the bodies of those they were supposed to inter. Famously, there is the case of the Irish giant who made his friends promise him that he would not be sold to an anatomist for study, and yet somehow ended up at an anatomist for study. It is believed that the undertaker filled his coffin with something and sold his body out the back door, essentially. But there was a lot of back dealings, a lot of, sly handshakes going on and exchanging of money. So these resurrectionists would go along to graveyards or to charitable hospitals, to workhouses, to undertakers, to anywhere that would have dead that people would not notice missing. And they would take these dead and they would bring them to the universities, to these anatomy schools, to surgeons themselves, and they would sell them for a price because there was a demand. Students were expecting that they would have cadavers. They were expecting that they would each have their own cadavers to study. And so where there is demand, there is profit to be made. So I have a quote here that sort of, I think, sums up well kind of this whole demand and supply thing that was going on at the time. So this is a report from the Select Committee on Anatomy from 1828, and it suggests that there were around 800 students at medical schools in London, of whom around 500 practiced dissection, and there were apparently around 450 to 500 corpses available to them each year. So clearly there was around one corpse to every student, or 2 students to a corpse maybe, but it didn't go much higher than that. And most of the students in the city of London were practicing dissection. 500 out of 800, 5 and 8 I can't make that fraction any lower. I'm not good at math. But yeah, so there was a high number of students who were expected to practice dissection, and so corpses had to be provided to them. And this is just London. This was also taking place in Edinburgh, in Manchester, in anywhere that there was a medical school. There were students practicing dissection, and this wasn't just in the UK. This was happening in Ireland, this was happening in America, this was happening all over the world, probably, but the cases I'm sticking to are mostly in the UK because that's kind of where the greatest documentation I have comes from. So clearly there was demand for these corpses, and the resurrectionists were willing to supply. However, there were some individuals for whom going out and robbing graves was just too difficult. So instead, they went on murder sprees to meet this demand. So we move into the serial killer portion of this conversation for today. I promised, and I will deliver serial killers. So this all starts with William Burke and William Hare, two Irish men who were living in Edinburgh while all of this was going on, and who, over the span of 10 months, killed approximately 16 people and handed them all over to Dr. Robert Knox for a hefty price to be used on his dissection table. Now, apparently, this all started when a man who was staying in the tavern died, and in order to recoup the cost of his stay, Burke and Hare sold his body to Robert Knox when they realized there was money to be made from this, and that they had an endless supply of victims that were coming into the inn and the tavern. Well, they just started killing them, suffocating them, piling them into a tea chest, and just walking them down the town to Robert Knox's back door and handing them over to him. It's also said, claimed by Robert Knox, that he had no idea where these bodies were coming from. He thought they were coming about them the normal way. He thought they were resurrectionists, not serial killers. But I mean, the man is a doctor, and he was getting the freshest corpses in all of Edinburgh. So I don't think he's going to ask too many questions about where they're coming from, but when that person is still warm, there's no way in hell you got them from a grave. 16 people in that good condition? No, I'm sorry. There's no way in hell that you think that they're coming by these by the normal means of things. But all of this was ended when Robert Knox turned on both Burke and Hare, and in return Hare turned on Burke. Lifelong buddies, those two, apparently. But yeah, so Knox got off scot-free, went back to his life. Hare, I believe, had to spend some time in prison, and then eventually went into hiding, as you would. People were very upset. Burke, on the other hand, was executed for his crimes. He was then dissected, preserved, and put on display at the University of Edinburgh. Karma's a bitch, my dude. She a bitch. And we love her for it. But that is the fate of Burke and Hare, the serial killers who were providing corpses for dissection. But they were the first big instance of this, the most well-known instance of this, but they were by no means the last. There were other individuals who decided that robbing graveyards was just too difficult. To be fair, at the time, the sort of law enforcement and the public were getting a lot more invested in what was going on. They were building watchtowers around graveyards to try and catch these resurrectionists in the act, so it was becoming a lot more difficult for them to do business, but still no reason to resort to, murder to get what you want. But Burke and Hare were not the first. They weren't the last. There were copycats after them. And when each and every case of this became public knowledge, the public, of course, were pissed. So the public outcry sort of led to more legislation being brought in regards to how the medical schools were coming about these cadavers, people, for the purposes of dissection. So the Anatomy Act was introduced in 1832. And the Anatomy Act meant that the unclaimed bodies of the poor from workhouses and charitable hospitals could be legally sold, meaning that there was no longer any need for resurrectionists to go out for graveyards. Surgeons, medical schools could simply go to a workhouse or a charitable hospital and pay them for the individuals who had died there and take them back to be studied. So because of this, there became a huge decline in the number of resurrectionists, sort of stealing remains, definitely declined the number of people killing people for remains. Also, poor people had started, once they realized that there was money to be made in this, they started selling their relatives to death dealers or to the surgeons themselves. Obviously, I say once they realized there was money to be made, I'm sure in a lot of circumstances it was a case of, I've got other mouths to feed and you're dead, or I can't afford for the funeral, so you'll be buried in a pauper grave and probably stolen by a resurrectionist anyway. So, or just desperate times call for truly desperate measures. I'm sure very few people went about this lightly, but there were people who sold relatives to universities and to surgeons as well. So because of all of this, resurrectionists and resurrectionism, I don't know if that's a word, as a career sort of went on the decline. Why illegally buy a body from a resurrectionist when you could legally buy a body from a workhouse or from a charitable hospital? A lot of these anatomy schools as well started merging into teaching hospitals. And so, therefore, they had a supply of bodies from the teaching hospital itself, and they didn't have to go to an outside source, such as a workhouse resurrectionist, poor family members, in order to acquire these bodies. They were all in-house, so to say, and therefore, it was just easier for them that way. And though because of the rise of these teaching hospitals as well, these sort of standalone anatomy schools with their wheeling and dealing sort of fell on the decline as well. And this sort of growth of medical schools, the legal acquiring of human remains, sort of everything becoming a lot more in the open and above board, is really the start of medical teaching and medical research as we know it now. Obviously, still a long way to go from there to where we are now, but that sort of medical school teaching dynamic is starting to develop here in the 1800s and will become what we inevitably see nowadays. Interestingly enough, I was reading a book a while ago. I never finished that book. I think I'm 5 pages. No, more than 5 pages. Anyway, it's called Stiff, and I think it's Stiff, the Curious Life of... No, I can't remember. It's definitely called Stiff. I can't remember who it's by. I'll leave it in the description of this episode. It's a fascinating book about, what happens to the human body after you die, in the sense of, if you donate your body to research, stuff like that, what happens to it. And from the introduction of that book, it sounds like, to my understanding, and to a little preliminary research I've done in this area, it sounds like the use of human remains in medical teaching is sort of on the decline as well, just because it's difficult to preserve them long enough for a student to go through a whole semester or 2 semesters studying them. It requires really harsh chemicals that are not great to be around long term, let alone be carving into and leaning over and breathing in as they're doing these dissections. Also, students don't feel the need to have these cadaver anatomy classes anymore. There's a lot of introduction of synthetic cadavers for this, and also medical students who are in a teaching hospital maybe don't feel the need for it because they have living, breathing people that they can, talk to and study from, in the sense of when a surgery is going on, they can observe it. There's no need to dissect. So just a combination of the sort of difficulties of using human cadavers long term and medical students nowadays, it seems like the use of human cadavers in medical study is on the decline. Medical research, I'm sure it's still quite useful, but by the sounds of it, there's almost too many people donating their body to science and too few people interested in using them. I'm not saying don't donate your body to science. It is a very important thing to do, and there's still uses for it. But what we think of when we think of dedicating our bodies to science, like being used by a medical student, apparently that is on the decline. Do your own research onto this. I've only looked very preliminary, but I find it interesting how there seems to have been like a whole 180 since the late 1800s, early 1900s, like complete flip in like the supply and demand of human remains for the purposes of medical study and research. I find that interesting. And now we're going to get into the archaeology of resurrectionists. Because, yes, indeed, there is archaeology of resurrectionism. Or to be more exact, there is archaeology of medical dissection. So, up until now, we've been discussing a lot of resurrectionists, of surgeons, of medical students, of Burke and Hare, and Robert Knox. But we haven't been discussing the individuals who were dissected. And what archaeological evidence and osteological evidence can tell us is like who these individuals were. It can also tell us like what kind of dissections were taking place and possibly what the students were studying as well. So there have been archaeological excavations of pauper hospital burial grounds, workhouse cemeteries, and former anatomy schools, which have found disarticulated and articulated human remains from dissections, likely from this period of medical study and research. So a lot of these human remains are found in charnel pits or charnel deposits. That essentially just means a pit or deposit with human remains in it. A charnel house would be a structure with human remains in it. But these are mostly found in pits or deposits. They can sometimes be found in coffins or just loosely in a pit. It is often difficult to determine how many individuals were buried. If they're loose, not in a coffin, that is to say, then it can be difficult to determine how many individuals are there. And then the coffins aren't always a good indication of how many individuals were buried as well. There are often incomplete skeletons, so just loose limbs, essentially, which may indicate that the anatomists and the students were taking limbs and dissecting them separate from the rest of the body and then burying those and not keeping an individual together and dissecting them all together. There's mismatched limbs as well, so when individuals are buried in coffin, it might not be one individual per coffin. It could be one head, one torso, 2 legs, 2 arms, but not necessarily all from the same individual. They're just Frankensteining them into the coffin, essentially not taking care to put the person, the victim of these dissections, back together again. So the coffins can tell us that. Also, a lot of the times, as I said, they're just in mass pits or mass burials and not taken any care to put them in a coffin at all. There's also loose bones sometimes, so like single tibia, single fibula, single patella, single vertebra, single cranium that are not associated with any other bones or just in a mass thing of other bones and are not considered associated with one another. So there's just, essentially, they were just disposed of as quickly as possible, presumably when these individuals were being grave robbed, you didn't want anyone to know what was happening to them. But it seems as though there wasn't much care taken in how they were deposited, as long as they were deposited so that no one would find them. It also doesn't seem as though many of them were given proper reburial, definitely weren't given proper reburials. I don't know actually if there's been any research into how many individuals buried in graveyards show signs of dissection, as in like if anyone was intentionally reburied, like back in their original grave or like back in a proper grave. I haven't seen any research of that. I'd be interested to see, but I'd say it was a rare phenomenon. I'd say most of them ended up in these mass graves on the locations where they were dissected, or they'd be sent back to the workhouse that they came from and buried on the land there. So from previous excavations across the UK, we can see that there are both men and women, though men seem to be more prominent in certain areas. This might have to do with the demographic. For example, if they're all coming from workhouses, depending on the type of workhouse, there might be more men there, and that might explain that. There's also signs on the bones that indicate many of them came from poorer backgrounds or from or were a part of manual labor, like hard labor, which slightly altered their bones structure, which suggests what the historical documentation suggests, which is that a lot of these individuals were from poorer backgrounds, as you might imagine, from individuals at charitable hospitals or workhouses, or who didn't have the money to invest in defending their graves. There were, at the time, inventions that people could purchase to put around their graves to try and stop the resurrectionists. So obviously the graves that were easier to rob were those of poorer individuals as well, and the osteology sort of backs that up in that sense. The age groups vary from young to old, including, slight trigger warning, but including infant and fetal remains. So they were dissecting infant and fetal remains as well. So there is evidence on the bones as well for the types of tools that were being used. There's evidence of handsaws, scalpels, evidence that they were possibly removing muscle from bone to study the muscles and stuff like that. You can see sort of the different types of dissections that were going on as well, and you can kind of see from the bone the experience of the anatomist, how clean the cut is. Essentially, like, the cleaner the cut, the more experienced the anatomist. The rougher the cut, or if the cut is fractured, it might suggest that the person doing the anatomizing was a student. So from the dissection planes, we can sort of try and piece together what they might have been studying as well. So we see a lot of dissected limbs in the archaeological record, which could suggest that they were studying amputations or how to perform amputations. Amputations would have been quite popular at the time. Popular? Yeah, I'm just going to go down the road and get my leg amputated. No, sorry. Amputations would have been quite necessary at the time. A lot of workplace accidents would have resulted in requiring an amputation. These days, you might do surgery, pin the bones all back in place, something like that. At the time, amputation probably would have been quicker, easier, and more effective. So there's evidence that they were studying how to do amputations. There's also craniotomies, which suggests that they were studying the brain. So craniotomy is when you have a transverse trisection. Transverse means a straight cut separating the top from the bottom. So a transverse transection through the top of the skull, taking the top of the skull off to study the brain. That's craniotomy transection, which would suggest that they were possibly studying the brain. Trepanation might have been common. I think it probably was still common at the time. Trepanation is drilling a burr hole into the skull. We still use it these days. It's mostly to relieve pressure. In the distant past, it was used to release spirits from the brain. It may have been used at this time. I believe it still was. And it still is today, so I presume it was still being used then, though I cannot confirm whether it was spirits or swelling that they used it from. Probably should have looked that up first. That was also taking place. We have thoracotomies taking place as well, which is cutting through the thorax, through the front of the chest, through the ribs, sternum, and clavicles, which are the two things at the top of your arms that go across your torso. This is a terrible explanation. But thoracotomy suggests that they were possibly studying the internal organs as well to understand how the internal system works. Also, we have evidence of fastenings and bracings being used. So these would be metal, wire, metal, like solid metal pieces that were used to either put back together something that had been dissected or to keep together something that was loose, i.e. keeping the bones of the hands, the carpals and the metacarpals, together, keeping the bones of the feet together. And all of this might suggest that certain individuals were, after being dissected, were being put on display for further research and study. These likely just would have been the skeletons. There's also a sign that some bones were being painted on, possibly painting muscle insertion points to learn muscle anatomy and such. We still have plastic skeletons today. I used to use them in college that have muscle points painted on the bone. My brain's not working. They have painted on plastic bone where the muscles would attach to the bone. It's not always clear to see on the bone where the muscles would attach. Most of the time you just have to know. I'm very bad at muscles. Don't ask me any question. I remember none of where they're called or where they attach. Not my forte. But all of this suggests that there were individuals whose skeletons were put on display for further research and then were at some point reburied with the rest of the dissection victims in these pits and in these deposits. However, there are some remains that were never reburied and that to this day are still on display in universities and in museums. There's Surgeons' Hall in Edinburgh. There's quite a few skeletons there. Many of them came from the university, from their medical school, and many of them would have dated back to this period as well. There's also wet specimens, which are on display. Again, these are seen at Surgeons' Hall in Edinburgh and other institutes. Wet specimens would be specimens of skin, organs, fetuses, whole people. I'm not sure if you could do a whole person, I'm sure you probably could, that are preserved in liquid. I don't know what liquid it is. I want to say formaldehyde, but I don't know that that's true. Somebody tell me if it is or not. But that are preserved in liquid for the purposes of display. A lot of times these would be individuals with, or these would be like pathologies that are preserved. So like tumors or weird growths, or I've been to Surgeons' Hall, I cannot name what was there. But stuff like that would be preserved as wet specimens as well. A lot of those are still on display. Obviously, a lot of this is hotly debated, especially when it comes to the individuals whose consent was never given for them to be studied in the first place, let alone put on display. Or in the case of, I'll say it again, the Irish giant, who specifically stated he did not want to be put on display, and yet up until very, very recently was still on display. They've since taken him off display, but he's still there. They're not reburying him. There's so many other individuals who likely did not ask for this, would not have consented to this if asked, that are just on display in museums and such. It's a big ethical conundrum. It's a debate for another episode, but a debate I would be interested in having, though I think the type of topic that it is would be better done in conversation with others as opposed to me just talking to you, because I feel like it is the kind of thing you need multiple insights to. So I'm going to work on that for a future episode. I've got some people in mind that I think would be interesting having a debate about it. Not so much a debate as just a conversation about it. I feel like everyone's got different standards for what they think is okay, necessary for educational purposes, stuff like that. But it is a hotly debated topic. There are laws in the UK around the display of human remains, but the law and the ethics of it are not always equal. So that's my little spiel about the display of human remains. I just want to state also, I don't agree with the display of human remains in most circumstances. There are certain circumstances where I think it is acceptable. Like I said, I have been to Surgeons Hall. Some of those I understand, others I don't. It's a nuanced topic, and it requires further study or thought. I'll talk about it at a later date. Anyway, so it's clear that like resurrectionists and anatomists, medical students, were certainly involved in unethical and often illegal practices when it came to the advancement of medical research and medical teaching. However, I think it is important to note that we likely would not be where we are today without these actions. That is not to condone the actions at all, but it is to state that we wouldn't have the medical information, the anatomical information we have today, were it not for these anatomists, these resurrectionists, these unethical and illegal practices. It doesn't mean they were right, but we should acknowledge where we come from. And this is where medical research comes from. There are, of course, much, much darker things that have occurred in medicine that have led to advancements that, you know, are still significant to this day. But that's not today's topic. I just think it's important to note where we come from and this kind of messed up origin of modern medicine. Who would have thought it would have involved serial killers? Not me. So on that dark, depressing note, thank you all for listening to this week's episode. I've been so happy to chat with you guys about this. If you have any questions about this week's episode, you can feel free to comment below the YouTube video for this episode, or you can go to my Instagram at TheResurrectionWoman and ask me there. I will be happy to answer any questions that I can, or point you towards resources for questions I can't answer. On the topic of resources, there will be a bibliography for this episode in the description below, so you can peruse that if you like. So thank you all so much for listening. I hope this episode haven't turned you off and that you are willing to follow along for future episodes. It's been so fun sitting down and chatting resurrectionists and medical history to you all. I will see you in next week's, I will hear you, see you. What is a podcast outro? I don't know. Anyway, next week's episode. See you then.